about a recent historical perspective of how China has dealt with a previous viral outbreak and some of the lessons that we can draw from that, and not just about China, but actually about how we're handling this current situation in the United States and even here in Montana. I mean, these lessons are really universal. So I'm going to go back to the mid-1990s in China, and specifically a province called Henan, which is a major agricultural base in China. But at the time, they didn't have much else. So in the 1990s, when China began opening up its economy and ramping up economic development and ties with the rest of the world, they let individual provinces make their own decisions about local economic development, depending on their local conditions. So depending on natural resources, populations, different factors like that. Now, Henan province has more people than any other province in China, but at the time, it didn't have much else. And as you all know, if you're joining us from Montana, farming is not the easiest way to make a living, and it's a difficult way to ramp that up into a major economic development force. And so the local leaders in Henan decided that one way they could build their economy into a powerful force would be to create what they called a plasma economy. Now, what we're talking about is human blood plasma. So they came up with a plan to pay poor farmers and villagers for their blood plasma, and they would then use that plasma to create biological medicines that are necessary in all kinds of medicines, used treatment for autoimmune disorders, treatment for hemophiliacs. In fact, we're starting to see plasma as an experimental treatment right now for COVID-19 patients, using the plasma of people who've already had the virus and getting secondary immune effects from that. So plasma has widespread applications in medicine. And blood, human blood, was something that Henan province had a lot of. So they came up with this idea, which in the abstract and looking back on it sounds kind of strange and grotesque, but you probably know this, we're doing the same thing in the US right now with the paid plasma donation system. Back in the mid-90s, when China started this, at the same time, there was ongoing around the world the emergence and outbreak of HIV and AIDS. Now, part of the reason that China decided to start this plasma economy was that the country at that time did not have documented AIDS cases or emergence of the HIV virus. So they believed they were safe. And the Chinese government had classified AIDS as a foreign disease and kind of given a lot of Chinese people who didn't have a ton of good science information the impression that they were safe from this virus because they were Chinese and in China. What happened, as you can imagine, what happened when you have that kind of situation was the virus did creep into the plasma system. So you had hundreds of thousands of farmers selling their blood plasma in government-run donation centers every day. And once the virus crept in, at that time they hadn't figured out how to kill the virus with heat, it very quickly spread through the system. And there was a doctor in southern Henan province who caught this. Her name was Wang Shuping. Wang Shuping was watching for the emergence of hepatitis in the plasma system. She had been hired by the government to monitor the health of donors. Hepatitis was a major problem in China at the time. She began seeing strange things in blood samples that indicated to her there might be a problem with HIV in the plasma bank system. So she used her own money to buy test kits and started testing batches of the blood plasma. And she right away found a very high rate of positive tests. More than half of the samples that she collected tested positive for HIV. So you can imagine you have this population that's never been exposed to the virus, that really knows nothing about it because there's been no public health information at the time in China about what the virus is or how it spreads or how to keep yourself safe. And they started seeing incredible rates of positive tests for HIV. The other thing to remember about this time is there was no treatment for AIDS. And so once you had the virus, it was almost certainly a death sentence. It was also something you could pass on to your family pretty easily. So they began seeing rates of infection of 20–25% in small villages in Henan province. Now, Wang Shuping, who had grown up during the Cultural Revolution in China and was kind of an ideal public servant, really believed in doing the public good, felt that she was doing her job by reporting this to her bosses in the province and then the bosses in Beijing. She was shut down, she was fired, she was threatened physically, she was silenced, and she was told to go away. And the government sat on this information for many weeks without doing anything. Eventually, and I believe it was 12 weeks after she had started reporting the emergence of HIV in the plasma system, the government shut down the blood banks in the Henan province. So eventually action was taken, but the government still was intent on covering up what had happened. So Wang Shuping went to Beijing, got a new job there, and the news started leaking out into Chinese press that there was an outbreak of AIDS in Henan province in these tiny villages, and it had come through the plasma system. It then leaked into the international press in the late 90s and early 2000s and became a huge international scandal because people in these villages were dying of AIDS and leaving behind orphans. And so you had what they called AIDS villages. Wang Shuping, who was young at the time, in her early 30s, could tell she didn't have a career or personal future in China in the work that she was doing, which is viral research. And so she very quietly, without telling anyone that she had been the whistleblower in all of this, left for the US. She got a job in Salt Lake City as a cancer researcher. And that's where she was for the last 10 years. Now, what's interesting in all of this is if you think, oh, this is 25 years ago, we've moved past that. China deals with public health crises in a different way now. They're much more open. A lot of that is true. But Wang Shuping's case is very instructive to how the government is still concealing what happened in this particular part of China. So last year, she actually came forward a couple of years ago and wrote a piece of her own explaining what had happened. And it was the first time that she put her face to being a whistleblower. Last year, a playwright staged a play about her life in London. And before the opening, Wang Shuping's family back in China started getting threats from the government that the play needed to be shut down, that she needed to stop talking about this problem, that it was over, that it would create huge problems for her family back in China if this play went on. Well, the play did go on. She went to the premiere in London, and a couple of weeks after returning to Salt Lake City, to her home, she was out hiking with her husband in the mountains and died of a sudden heart attack. This was about 6 months ago, and she was only 59 years old. So I think you can say that even though this happened 25 years ago, she was harassed until her death for exposing a crisis that affected a lot of poor people and a lot of people who didn't have power within China. I met her several times and spent a lot of time talking with her about this. And she told me that even though, and this was before the coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, so she actually died before the coronavirus emerged, which seems like a lifetime ago, but wasn't that long ago. I had asked her if she thought that China had corrected its mistakes in covering up that crisis and if they would do better in handling a future public health crisis. And she was adamant that it was going to happen again, that in both China and the United States, wealth and power took precedence over the lives of poor people, and that none of us were really equipped to deal with this very well. And I think about that last conversation I had with her quite a bit, because I think we're seeing that all play out right now. So kind of what are the lessons from all of this thing that happened 25 years ago for us in this current moment right now? I would say censorship and cracking down on information in the midst of a pandemic is exactly the wrong thing to do. We've already seen a lot of evidence that China was not forthcoming about what was happening in Wuhan. We have already seen the death of a whistleblower doctor who tried to sound the alarm about this virus. we have already seen evidence that the numbers coming out of China were probably greatly underestimated, both in terms of infections and in terms of the death rate. We're also starting to see strains of the same thing happening in the US right now, which I find incredibly troubling. We're seeing our own federal government backtracking and concealing information about what was known and what was not known, what steps were taken and what steps were not. And if you talk to anyone who works in public health, they will tell you that the most important things to do in a crisis like this are to be transparent and forthcoming with data and tell people what you know so that people have the information to protect themselves. I would hope that we would learn the lessons that came from China 25 years ago. And I think in some places we have, but I think we've fallen short in a lot of places. And it's part of the reason that we're in the position in the US that we're in right now. So that's my little history lesson for you on epidemics in China. And I would be happy to take any questions. I'm stuck here in my house, so I'm kind of eager to talk to people. So please ask me questions.
Kathleen, thank you so much for that. I mean, it's really an incredible story, linking the dots, if you will, from decades ago to today. Let me kick off with a question of my own. You talked a little bit about the sharing of information and transparency, but vis-a-vis a kind of political cover-up. Just setting that aside for a moment, can I ask you, in order to appropriately share information of this scope and scale when we're talking about a pandemic, there has to be some very basic elements in place, very technical elements that, towns can talk to cities, cities can talk to federal governments can then utilize and share that information with other governments around the world. So in terms of, you can have a kind of political cover-up, but if that's not the case, and if it weren't the case, do we have the kinds of systems present in the world that would allow for transparent flow of useful information to have, let's say, been sent from Wuhan to Beijing and then immediately out to the world in a way that was usable to the rest of the world? Over to you.
I think the system, I do think the system is in place. China has a pretty incredible functional information system internally. They have very good internal information about what is happening in China. The difference between what is internal and what is external can be pretty stark sometimes. I mean, the Xinhua News Service has a whole division called the internal news, which is news produced for the leadership and for government officials, and that's not accessible by the general public. So the infrastructure exists there. I also think the infrastructure of the World Health Organization is important, although they have fallen short on this in a number of ways, primarily being Taiwan. Taiwan has been a great success story in all of this and is not allowed membership in the WHO, largely because of political fighting with China. So I think that the infrastructure exists, but I also think that it has gotten, as you said, so highly politicized that it wasn't used properly. I would say epidemiologists, public health officials have been working on this infrastructure for decades because they've expected this virus. No one who works deeply in this field didn't think it would happen eventually. So they have been setting up this infrastructure. I think in the US, one of our big problems in terms of communication and getting this information out, and we're going to see it get worse, has been the decline of local newspapers. So as you know, our local newspapers have been really cut to the bone in the last 15 years. And I think it's something like half of the staff of newspapers in America has been lost in the last 15 years. And we really see that play out in small towns in places like Montana. That has actually resulted in, because local newspapers often had health reporters who would track things like that. This is actually, there's been stories about this, resulted in a loss of information for epidemiologists in the United States tracking the spread of things like the flu. So our information ecosystem is a little bit different here than in China. The media infrastructure is run by the government, funded by the government, primarily here in the US, where it's dependent on advertising and often owned by large corporations, our information infrastructure has been cut so much that we've actually lost the ability to track disease outbreaks by local news stories. So I think there's a couple of different things going on. I think the infrastructure does exist in the world. I think the US is in a slightly weaker place because we don't have the system that we relied on for so long, which was local newspapers deeply covering their communities and the health of their communities.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Here's a question from a participant. Do you think that China seeing HIV/AIDS as a quote unquote foreign virus is similar to certain leaders in the US claiming COVID-19 as a Chinese virus?
I think it's exactly the same. And I'm glad you brought that up. I think it is exactly the same thing. And you portray a virus which does not have a nationality. They do emerge from places, but they don't have passports. You portray a virus as being something associated with a group of people, you actually leave yourself in a much more vulnerable position. And that's exactly what happened in China. It was portrayed as a disease that only foreigners got, and it was transmitted by foreigners. And as a result, Chinese people were unprepared when the virus hit them, especially in Henan province. And I do think that we've seen a lot of that play out in the US, particularly in January and February. It's been very interesting for me to watch because I still pay a lot of attention to China. And so I was following all of the news reports out of China in January and February about the virus and what was happening in Wuhan, what was happening in Beijing and Shanghai and all over the country. And it was shocking to me to see how long it took for most Americans to take it seriously. As I was watching it, I thought that there were three things that did it. There was the NBA closing down their season. There was Tom Hanks announcing that he had the virus. I guess it was those two things. It was celebrity and NBA that felt like it really brought it home to people. And it did feel to me that people in the US potentially weren't taking it as seriously because they saw it as a virus that was affecting Chinese people. And then Italy, which also brought it home a little bit, I think, to Americans, which is bizarre. I mean, China should have been a warning siren for all of us. If you were watching what happened in China, it was pretty clear what was going to happen in the US if we didn't take aggressive, proactive action, and we didn't. So I think this ongoing call to call it the Chinese virus is incredibly dangerous. Also, in terms of racism, which we've seen a ton of reports of racism around the US emerging as a result of it. So it leaves us unprotected and it fuels racism. So yeah, I think it's very similar to what happened in China with HIV and AIDS.
Kathleen, here's another one from our audience. Using your experience in China, do you have any advice for Americans on how to fight disinformation in our communities, originating, for example, from federal level radio broadcasts and our neighbors?
It's a good question, and I've thought about that a lot. So one thing that is interesting to know is that if you look at any survey of Americans about media and information, the most trusted sources of news from most Americans is local news, whether that be local newspapers or local television. And so Americans really do trust the information that comes from within their own communities and the journalists who are doing that work. The downside to that is that we are already seeing even more severe cuts to local news because of the pandemic, because advertising revenue has dried up. So big picture, I mean, small picture, my advice is to rely on news at the local level. Local health departments are doing a good job of getting information out. Local television and local newspapers are working incredibly hard right now to get out accurate information. I would say cable television is a really bad place to go for information. I also think that it's really time, and we're already seeing how the crisis in local newspapers is affecting us in the midst of this pandemic, and it's going to get worse. I would say that right now, is probably the time to start talking about public funding models for local media in the US. I think we're beyond the point that that might be necessary. So I guess, having seen the tightly controlled, it's been really interesting to watch media ecosystems in China, which are so tightly controlled by the government, and then come back to the US where there isn't that government control. We don't have that. What we have is corporate control, which is doing incredible damage to the information on the local level. So I think that we have to start thinking big picture about new creative ways to fund local news, because that's the credible information that people trust, and that's what we need more of, not less of, which is what we're seeing right now.
Kathleen, here's another question from a guest, kind of on the other side of this previous question. When I first heard the rumor that the virus had escaped from the Wuhan virus lab, it seemed to fit some crazy conspiracy theory. Now I'm not so sure. Is it possible? What do you think? And how would we ever get to the bottom of this? Transparency in this case would be the last thing China would want, I would think. Over to you.
Yeah. So the first thing I say to that question is, at this moment right now, it doesn't really matter. What matters right now is tracking, tracing, and trying to tamp down the virus. There has been no credible reporting or studies that indicate this virus came from a lab. I completely understand why this conspiracy theory takes off. I really do. Because China is so averse to openness, and the fact that they just kicked out American reporters from major newspapers from covering the country, you do get suspicious about what information they're hiding. What I can tell you is there have been a number of credible reports in scientific journals that indicate this virus did not come from a lab, that indicate this virus came from a natural transmission. And so I think we will get that information because there's more scientific study underway. I think we'll get even stronger indication of where the virus comes. The thing you have to understand, and the thing that's difficult for me to understand sometimes, is that science takes a long time. And so tracking down the exact animal route of transmission when you have a brand new virus like this is really difficult, and it's not something that's going to come quickly. So in the absence of that scientific evidence, you start to see these theories emerge. What I can say, though, is I have seen no credible evidence that supports the lab leak theory. I have seen lots of credible evidence to suggest that's not true. And I'm not talking about just Chinese studies, I'm talking about international studies that are ongoing. So I completely understand why that rumor gets traction. There isn't any evidence right now to support it. And I think that people need to be, like I said in the beginning, the other thing is it doesn't really matter at this point where it came from. What matters is containing and dealing with the virus. I think that it's an attractive line of thinking to ponder, but there's no evidence to support it. And there's plenty of evidence to support the opposite. So I guess I would just advise some patience until we wait for the science to show us exactly how it was transmitted from animals to humans.
Kathleen, we have time for one last question. This comes from Dr. Jennifer Westar, who joined us on Tuesday. She says, regarding your comment on local news versus cable news, how is it that doctors are regulated and can be sanctioned by medical councils, lawyers by the Law Society, accountants by the accounting body, but journalists are not held accountable or sanctioned by anybody? Over to you.
Well, it's the First Amendment, I guess. I mean, that's been, if you read American history, this is not a new problem for us, disinformation. We have been dealing with this for more than a century. And journalism in our most recent century was pretty well self-regulated in terms of codes of ethics, journalism schools, training people. We're starting to see the rise of disinformation amid the collapse of that. And so I don't know what the answer is there. It's interesting. We do have journalistic bodies who technically cover ethics and things like that, but we don't have boards of governance. And I think that is one of those areas that most journalists would really bristle at, the idea of a government body approving or disproving what you report and what you write. So we've really had a group of people take advantage of our First Amendment protections and use those in ways that are very damaging. It's happened before in the US. It's not a new thing. I think I will say one very heartening thing in all of this. I saw a study yesterday that indicates that people are actually turning away from partisan media right now and turning back to their local news sources. That partisan media is flatlining in terms of new viewers, in terms of adherence, and that local news is back on the rise again. Now, the problem is local news is, there are furloughs and layoffs all across the country in the last few weeks because advertising revenue has dried up. So the model is broken. The model is going to get worse. The good news is that I think that most people can tell the difference between partisanship and credible information. And so I'm hopeful that in the aftermath and the wreckage of all of this, we might be able to rebuild something more credible. But I take your point completely. I don't think you're going to get journalists to agree to have a sanctioning body, even though we can see the damage that's been done now. I think that would make people really nervous. So I hope we find a different way forward and people start going back, and they already are going back to their more trusted sources of information.
Kathleen, thank you very much for that. Normally, I would hand the last word back to you, but I'm unfortunately well over time, or fortunately, because there were so many great questions from the participants. Thank you, Kathleen, for joining.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Yeah, it's been great to have you here, and thanks to Dr. Westrup for joining on Tuesday and today, and to all of the others who came in. Next week on Connect Montana, we have an All Ireland Week. We will have 5 webcasts, one each day, exploring a different aspect of the connections between Montana and Ireland, which are deep and rich historically, economically, and socially. So it promises to be a great week. If you have any other ideas for shows, please send them to me at info@montanaworldaffairs.org. Visit our Facebook, visit our Instagram, go to our website. Let me know what's going on out there, people, to see if this is good or if we can improve it in any way. Until then, wishing you all good health, safety, and have a nice weekend. Goodbye.